start off today in talking about the topic at hand, which is reclaiming space in our bodies as they are, with my favorite gigantic sun protection mechanism, this big old beach hat. I think that that often we have this sense that like we should stay hidden if we're not moving through the world in the ideal body. And the reality is that like the ideal body is something that doesn't necessarily actually exist. And so today we're really focusing on and talking about how to reclaim joy in our bodies as they are in this moment without feeling that we need to modify them in some way or to hide beneath a giant sun hat. So I'm going to take off my sun hat because it is very unwieldy for being inside of the house, but it does provide a lot of protection. Whew. And now I have some excellent hat hair, and that's okay. So before we dive into the content today, we wanted to front load some resources in case folks do have challenging feelings come up around this topic. And we'll unpack that a little bit in the front part of the workshop, what those challenging feelings are and some tools for managing them. But in case you need outside resources, that's what you can find on the following screens. So we'll leave them up for about 5 seconds each, so you can take a screenshot if you need or want to for future reference in case you need them moving forward. So these are some resources pertaining to general mental health. On the next slide, I believe we have a couple more. These ones are related to eating disorder treatment specifically. So if you need those types of resources, that's what you can find on this slide. On the next slide, there's some virtual support for eating disorders. So really important in the current moment, given that while things are opening up, for lots of us, remaining in the house for safety is something that is necessary, or maybe you don't have localized support available, so virtual support can help you out with that. On the next slide, there's some more resources for virtual support. And finally, Sheena's place contact information in case you need or require it. So with all of that being established, I'll throw the ball over to you, Christine, to get us into the next part.
Awesome. Thanks, Sookie. Welcome, everyone. Thank you all so much for being here today and for tuning in on a Monday. Of course, we wanted to get started with a territory acknowledgement, acknowledging that folks are, of course, tuning in from all over the virtual space or geographical space. Sookie and I will be acknowledging the territory that we, the both of us, are operating from. So I'll quickly read this out loud and then share a little bit afterwards. We would like to acknowledge the sacred land on which we are gathering. It has been a site of human activity for 15,000 years, and this land is the territory of the Huron-Wendat, the Petun First Nations, the Seneca, and the Mississaugas of the Credit River. The territory is the subject of the Dish with One Spoon, One Pun Belt Covenant, which is an agreement between the Haudenosaunee Confederacy and the Confederacy of the Ojibwe and allied nations to peacefully share and care for the resources around the Great Lakes. Today, the meeting place of Toronto or Tekaronto is still the home to many Indigenous peoples from across Turtle Island, which is North America, and we are grateful to have the opportunity to work in the community on this territory. And so something that I always like to share personally is the fact that as somebody who is an immigrant settler, so I was not born here on this land, but I was able to come here and be able to settle here. I am definitely somebody who directly benefits from the colonialism that has been taking place for many years here. And so that's something that I am always mindful of when I think about my relationship to the land here, my relationship to the resources I have access to, and of course, the relationships that I have and continue to grow on and continue to connect with in terms of the people around me and the work that I do. And specifically with the work that I do around inclusion, thinking about anti-oppression, anti-racism, and of course, thinking through what body liberation work is, and we will definitely dive more into that later in this webinar. It is really important for me to acknowledge the ways in which that I have benefited from this colonial violence that continues and is ongoing. And I think about the Indigenous pals I have in my life, the privilege that I have in accessing the resources and the knowledge, especially the knowledge that I'm able to share with you folks here. Of course, entering into the conversation with tons of humility and acknowledging the fact that a lot of my learned knowledge that I'm able to apply in my professional work and also personal work is very much rooted in and has come from the folks who have been doing advocacy work, who have been doing activism work, and specifically Black and Indigenous folks who are very much at the center of a lot of the different liberation movements. And that all ties into the fact that we all take up space in this land and that we're here to share resources with one another. And that specifically speaks to also the Dish with One Spoon belt here, and this is just a copy of it, but that is important for us to learn more, and especially if you are a settler and non-Indigenous, that we learn about the land that we take up space in, and to be able to then act in allyship and further to think about how we can move forward to minimize harm as much as possible, especially for those who are settlers and have access to the resources that we have. Because at the root of this a dish with one spoon is the idea that we're here to share resources with that one spoon to be passed around to all of the folks who exist in this space. And so this is really, I think, very apropos in the sense of us, Sookie and I here, being able to share some information with you folks, that you have the resources more so to be thinking about, having a body and what does that mean to have a body on this land. So that's a little bit about a territory acknowledgement here, and I invite folks to be thinking about this as we move forward in the conversation about where we have access to resources, where we have access to conversations and spaces that potentially can enable healing, and also how we can often take up space in ways that may not be as positive, and that we can also work on those parts of ourselves in order to make spaces less harmful as well. So that is a little bit about that. Of course, we want to recognize that there are tons of, like I said, colonial violence continues till today and will continue tomorrow, unfortunately. And so we wanted to acknowledge that it is a very hard time for many folks across Turtle Island, from the recent discovery and the continual discovery of the graves across all different residential schools. And we wanted to make sure that folks have access to a crisis line here in case if you do need it, or if you know a pal who needs it. And also to acknowledge that it is Indigenous Peoples Day today, as well as summer solstice. There are many, many things happening all across, and to acknowledge that there may be some things that you can do, again, as settlers, for those who are, that this is something that you can learn more about if you're unfamiliar with this. And if you have access to this and you have Indigenous folks in your life, that would be great to connect on as well. And so that is just the initial part of this into our introduction. If it's all right to introduce yourself, Sarah, Sookie, would you like to go first?
Absolutely. Thanks, Christine. So hi, everyone. As I said, I'm Sookie Bardwell. I use the pronouns she, her, or they, them. Either is fine for me. I'm really excited and I guess just like overall finding that it's wonderful to be here with all of you today to talk about a topic that I think comes up for lots of folks, especially given that we're living in a particularly challenging moment, what with having been kind of under the impacts of a global pandemic for the last over a year, and going through a whole variety of different changes socially and physically as a result. And so what I've heard from lots of folks in my life in the last several months is that they're feeling pretty disconnected with their bodies and like not finding a lot of safety within themselves and feeling a lot of apprehension about the warmer weather and all of the ways in which that means that we become maybe even more hyper aware of our bodies if we're not already, because we're wearing less clothing to feel comfortable or more comfortable as is possible in what is often some pretty stifling heat. And so I am someone who has spent a lot of my life in a swimsuit, and I'll tell you more about that later. But I think that an idea that has really been central in my own thinking, or was central in my own thinking when I experienced a lot more discomfort in my own body, was how uncomfortable it is to go to places where we can access some like respite from the heat and some cooling, like the beach. And so really excited to be here today to talk about kind of why that's an experience that many of us might have, and how we can resist that individually and collectively to reclaim some joy and some space within our bodies as they are now, and resist and refuse the pressure to like physically modify our bodies in order to access those spaces and to access that joy. So a little bit about me, if you haven't met me before, I have been doing equity and inclusion work for the last 2 decades, which is a really heck of a long time. Really honored to do that work and to do that work alongside Christine with a specific focus in this instance on body liberation and challenging all of the ways in which we're told that we're not having a body properly through a whole variety of different lenses to help folks feel a little bit more at home in themselves. That's work that I have a really passionate commitment to as someone who moves through the world in a fat body. My body is a place that has not been super safe for me to be because of my fatness, because of my experience as a non-binary queer person, and because of my experience as a feminine person and of someone who moves through the world with disabilities. And so talk lots about that today. But I think ultimately it's also important for me to understand, as Christine was voicing, how my access to power and to privilege as a white settler on this land also means that like I am heard differently in conversations around challenging some of the forms of body terrorism that I'm not subjected to, like white supremacy and anti-Indigenous and anti-Black and anti-Asian racism, for example. And so that can be a complex experience, but one that I am really grateful to hold space for and to unpack a little bit with and for folks. And so that's our hope today. And I think that's all I'll say about myself, and I'll throw the ball back over to you, Christine.
Thanks, Sookie. Hi, everyone. My name is Christine Hsu. I use she, her, and they, them pronouns. And I'll quickly just share, so I've already shared that I'm an immigrant settler. I am also non-binary, and as somebody who also entering into this conversation about body liberation, it's important for me to name also the power and privileges that I have access to. One of which that will likely show up time and time again is the fact that I do experience and benefit from thin privilege as somebody who has a background in physical and health education, as a teacher, as a personal trainer or movement coach is more so what I call it. This is something that is very close to me as somebody who more often than not is in the role of support work as opposed to experiencing direct fat phobia and sizeism. This is important for me to name and to acknowledge that, for some folks, even my presence and with my body in this conversation can be activating. So I definitely want to acknowledge that and say that I want to validate too for folks who are seeing me, who may have read about me. Perhaps you Googled my name. I hope you didn't, but if you did, you will definitely see a lot more sports and athletic related type work that will pop up. A lot of the work right now is very much steeped in trans and non-binary inclusion in sports across Canada and sometimes across North America as well. So that's really some of the hats that I wear when talking about body liberation. And of course, I am very grateful to be working alongside Sookie to be able to collaborate and to ensure that that we are here to speak to as many experiences as much as we can to allow for people who are seeing us and in the audience to feel like you can connect to the things that we're sharing. So we will definitely be sharing from different perspectives and backgrounds. But for me, as somebody who does more of the support work, often I'm often thinking about the folks in my life, including Sookie, of course, but also my mom, who also moves through the world in a fat body and has experienced a lot of fat phobia, weight stigma, sizeism. That when I do this work, these are the folks that I hold very close to me in my heart. And of course, all of the people that I've been able to connect with through this work. Again, that is very much an access of privilege and a lot of the trust that people instill in me. So I'm going to put it ahead of time in saying thank you all so much for trusting me and for the work that you're doing to enter into this conversation for yourself and or for other folks in your life as well. So that's a little bit about me. Suki and I will definitely be sharing more about ourselves using our own experiences to put it into context for the rest of the conversation here today. Feel free to for me, if you do have any questions in particular with movement, with having a body and any of the more so the health sciences side of this conversation, feel free to drop in the questions or comments that you may have, and I would be happy to address those as much as I can for the rest of the webinar. Okay, so that is it for now. I'll throw it back to Suki to continue the introduction here.
Thanks, Christine. So this is a quote from Maya Angelou that Christine and I like to share at the start of every workshop that we do, our every webinar, because I think it's really central to the approach that we take and the understanding that we bring into the space. So the brilliant Maya Angelou tells us that we should do the best we can until we know better, and then when we know better, that we are beholden to do better. And I think that's a really important thing to hold as central in our minds, because it recognizes that we all already know a whole bunch of things, right? And we're all trying the best we can. I truly don't believe that most people are waking up every morning being like, how am I going to hurt the people around me today? And if that is what you're doing, kindly stop. But because that's not the case, it unfortunately doesn't mean that we're not doing harm to ourselves and others on a daily basis. And that's because we've internalized a whole bunch of different messages about how to be in the world with each other, with ourselves. And so really our interest here is in meeting folks where they're at and unpacking some of those messages so that we can do better moving forward. And that's really our goal. So we'll ask folks to hold that as central in your thinking as we're moving forward over the course of the webinar today. There's also several group guidelines that we like to bring into the space. So maybe, Christine, we can just bob back and forth to read them out. The first one is care for ourselves and each other. So recognizing that like we might be unpacking and unlearning a whole bunch of stuff, and that might be really challenging, important to take care. And we're going to start off by talking quite a lot about managing challenging feelings that might come up and why they might come up. But taking care of yourself is part of doing that and really central to doing that. As well, being kind to other folks who are in the space. Recognizing, going back to that Maya Angelou quote, that there's all kinds of things that we might not know as individuals, holding space for that unknowing, and making sure that we think about the impact that our comments might have for other folks who might have different experiences from ourselves. So I'll throw the ball back over to you, Christine, for that.
All right. The next one is openness and curiosity. So, of course, as Suki said, there may be things that we don't know about. And sometimes some folks will say, like, you don't know what you don't know, and that's absolutely okay. And so we want this space to be accessible in the sense that folks can ask questions, and as many questions as much as possible. But in doing so, we invite people to think about how you're asking your questions and why you're asking your questions, to kind of just sit with that for a moment before you pose the questions, or you can absolutely private message Suki or I to kind of check in with us. And then if you want to ask it to the larger group, you can absolutely do that from there. We ask this and invite folks to do this because oftentimes this is where we insert, if you like to play devil's advocate, we really invite you to not do that. Not today, Satan. There's so many things to advocate for in the world, and the devil is not one of them. So please, this is more of an invite for folks to speak from your own personal experiences, ask your questions that apply directly to you. Perhaps you're coming from a learning space, and you can preface it as such, or perhaps you don't even know what questions to ask, but you're kind of thinking about some things with curiosity, and you're coming from that place. You can absolutely just state, I'm trying to understand something here. This is my line of thought. This is what information I have had access to. I'm not sure where I'm headed with this piece of information. Can you provide more assistance? And it's anything along those lines that will, I think, allow for folks to be more able to engage with each other, and also for us to be able to speak to those pieces and also assist you in asking the questions that you really want to ask. So remaining open to what others may provide contribute into the conversation is also really key, because again, recognizing that we may be coming from potentially radically different experiences and understanding of having a body and what that is like, it certainly is important to stay as open as much as possible, and know that when folks share from where they're coming from, it isn't about you. It's definitely important to kind of do that kind of self check-in. If it does feel a little prickly or activating, that you take care of yourself, going back to that first point. So I'm going to throw it back to Suki for the next point.
Thanks, Christine. So we want to recognize that this is a conversation that can bring up some pretty big feelings for folks. And so this is a space for those feelings. They can be kind of difficult sometimes, they can be challenging. And we're going to talk lots in our next section about managing them. But we want to encourage folks to not ignore your feelings, right? To instead experience them as a source of information and as something that you can engage with as safely as you possibly can, recognizing that sometimes pushing feelings to the side might be the safety mechanism you need to use, right? But ultimately, if we're able to acknowledge that those feelings are there, we're much better able to engage with them and to unpack them to get somewhere, right? Instead of just having to sit with challenging feelings forever, we instead have the opportunity to move away from or move through them. So we'll ask folks to make space for that today to the best of your capacity, recognizing that, like, for some folks that might not be possible, and that's okay too, which brings us to our final point there.
And with this final point, it really is inviting you folks to think about what being kind to yourself can feel like, look like, and sound like. I'm practicing that self compassion piece because in this space here, we're aiming to learn and receive new information for some folks, and especially for some of the, perhaps for some folks, that information could be really challenging, both perhaps making you realize that you've been doing harm to yourself, maybe you've been doing harm to others, and just taking the moment in those moments to really just be gentle with yourself, in the sense that, like, perhaps you didn't have access to the information you needed, and that it is really hard to realize or come to those realizations that harm has been done. And what you can do is to be gentle with yourself and to understand that it's okay that you've arrived here. It's okay that you finally received the information that allow you to better understand and reflect on your past experiences, and that there is absolutely nothing wrong with having experienced those things in the past. And we'll definitely go through some more steps and have some conversations about what practicing radical self-compassion looks like. And we'll be inviting folks to share a little bit about that as well as we go through the conversation here today, because that is a huge, huge portion of our webinar here. And I'll throw it back to Suki for the next slide here. Please hold.
Christine. So just a final note around guidelines in regard to language. One of the things we do as part of our body liberation practice is a practice of language reclamation. So you've already heard me refer to myself as fat. That's how I describe my body, in a value neutral kind of way. And the reason that I do so is that, you know, over the course of my life, that language with that has been used to try and make me feel bad about myself, to put me down. And so taking it back and using it as a value neutral way to describe my body is part of taking the sting out. And so I'll invite other folks in larger bodies to engage in that same practice for themselves if they would like to do so, but also acknowledge that, like, not every person moving through the world in a fat body is going to be comfortable with that language. And so really important to understand that when we talk about language reclamation, that reclamation is a process, right? And the people are going to be at different places in that process. And so for that reason, important to make a note of that reality and to provide folks with this brief overview of why I'm using that language, because I think without speaking to it, sometimes folks are like, what did you just say? Because there is such a lengthy history that many of us have with that piece of language as something that we have had used to put us down or that we use to put ourselves down, right? And so healing from that violence is something that is really important for many of us in reclaiming space in our bodies. And the reason you'll see us using in round brackets is that for some folks, like, they've never had that space in their bodies, right? And so it's claiming for the first time for some of us and reclaiming for others. And language reclamation is part of that process. So in the interest of supporting us in that process, we have a few things on our agenda today. As I said, the first of those things will be dealing with big feelings, recognizing that, like, there are many feelings in the room. I think that this illustration is really key in that, which is holding as central that, like, time is limited, right? Existence is a very short time indeed. And so there aren't enough summers left for us to keep hating our bodies. And so what can we do to deal with the big feelings we're having to allow us to not have that experience moving forward? Christine, can I throw it to you to speak to the next one?
And we'll go over navigating body negativity. So defining the term in case if folks are not familiar with this term of body negativity. We'll also unpack it a little bit and go through some discussion points with some prompts to invite folks to start reflecting on these pieces and your own experiences. And again, just to preface the fact that this is, or rather the caveat is that today's conversation isn't going to solve everything, but it certainly is going to be perhaps a way to access more tools for you to start reflecting and thinking through what the next steps would be like for you, and how you can best move forward with some of perhaps the thoughts that are coming up for you. So we'll be going over navigating body negativity. I'll throw it back to you, Sookie. Next one.
Which will follow with some strategies for resistance. So recognizing that body negativity is something that's present for many of us in many spaces, what are some strategies that we can use to resist that body negativity and to reclaim that space for ourselves that's, like, free of that negativity or allows us the space to not internalize it at the very least? Throw the ball back over to you for the last one, Christine.
And lastly, as Sookie has alluded to already, we'll be going into sort of more of a way of thinking in recognizing that for some folks, again, you may be claiming your body for the first time. For other folks, maybe you're working on reclaiming your body. And so we'll have a short conversation about what that can look, sound, feel like for you, with some more tools and some affirmations to finish off our webinar. And that is today's agenda, in case if anyone is like, I'm in the wrong webinar. All right, so we'll move into our first section here, which is dealing with feelings and talking about bodies, and it can definitely be challenging. I'll throw it back to Sookie here to get us started.
So we wanted to start by acknowledging some of the reasons why talking about this topic might bring up some big and challenging feelings. And we'll invite you to drop into the chat any reasons that you might want to share about why this feels like a challenging conversation. So we'll give folks like maybe 30 seconds to drop that into the chat if you'd like to, and then I'll go over some of the reasons why I think that this could be a challenging conversation, or I have experienced it as a challenging conversation in the past. So feel free to type in anything you'd like to share. Absolutely. Absolutely. So I see some reference to society's ideals around bodies, some reference to self-blame and shame, to self-worth. Having a history of distress and disordered eating, for sure. Racism and name calling, other forms of discrimination. not ever having like lived a life that's free of struggling with body image, right? And not knowing what it's like to be comfortable in a body, experiencing fat phobia, going back to that other forms of discrimination. Absolutely, moving through the world with invisible disability. Totally. So like having the experience of looks determining whether or not you're welcome and accepted, which is something we can refer to with the language of looksism, right? Experiencing looksism, having childhood trauma around, you know, putting on swimsuits or warmer weather clothes and going into public spaces or otherwise, experiencing neglect and other types of abuse, for sure. For sure. Absolutely. So learning that our appearance is most central to our value as people and our validity as people and whether or not we're worthy of respect. Absolutely. Absolutely. So those are some pretty challenging experiences, right? All of them that can mean that like this brings up some big and challenging feelings when we're talking about reclaiming joy in our bodies, because our bodies are things that we often don't experience as super joyful places, because the world makes an enemy of ourselves. And we'll unpack that a little bit further because I think that can be a big and challenging idea. But I think what's most central in framing it that way for me is understanding that like if we feel bad in our bodies, that's not our fault, right? We're not to blame for the violence that we've experienced. We're not to blame for feeling uncomfortable. We're dissociated from ourselves, but rather we've been shouldered with the emotional labor of that experience, right? And so we wanted to start off by talking about managing big feelings, dealing with big feelings, because they're present, and pretending they're not here doesn't serve any of us. And so legendary psychosocial educator Mr. Rogers provides us with an excellent quote here, which is anything mentionable is manageable. And this is something that Christine and I definitely hold central in our work, which is the idea that like if we can find a way to talk about and to hold space for these challenging experiences, for these big and challenging feelings, then perhaps we can find a way to work through them to get ourselves to a place where joy and pleasure in our bodies feels more accessible. And so we want to encourage folks to, as we started off saying, hold space for these feelings as much as you're able to, right? While centering self-compassion and self-care, as well as and alongside self and community and collective care, recognizing that like each of us are having unique experiences of disembodiment and of feeling separate from ourselves, but that many of those experiences are interlinked and interwoven with one another, and that there's lots that we can do collectively to support one another in healing from and working through them. And that's really the idea behind accessing support, right? Is having support to work through challenging things so that they feel a little bit less challenging and more like things that we can manage together. So in thinking about what kinds of feelings will show up potentially today, I think it's really helpful to understand the role of past experiences, as many folks brought up, right? So trauma is something we can define really broadly, but there's lots of body trauma that folks have experienced in many different ways. And so really a definition of trauma that I found really helpful is any experience where you don't feel like you have access to help, a map, or an exit. Right? And so in a conversation around bodies, sometimes those are big feelings that come up, given that we live in a variety of systems, including white supremacy, capitalism, and patriarchy, and their unfortunate and hateful child colonialism that really separate us from ourselves and mean that we're having all kinds of experiences of violence. And so this is a great graphic from Karen B.K. Chan that can help us understand what the impacts of trauma activation can look like. So you have three kind of zones illustrated here, with the panic zone on the outside, the stretch zone in kind of beyond that, and the comfort zone in the middle. Now, the comfort zone is a lovely, comfortable place to be, but isn't always a great place for learning. Whereas the panic zone means that like we're likely to fall into some of the trauma responses illustrated around that graphic, right? So we might withdraw or avoid the conversation if we're kind of falling into a flight response. We might fight ourselves or others if we're falling into a fight response, or we might end up freezing and unable to engage. And so in regards to preparing for big feelings, we want to support folks in as much as is possible being in that stretch zone, because that's the richest space for learning. We're outside of our comfort zone, but we're not activated to a point where we're not able to engage. And so awareness of activation is kind of a key point in navigating the feelings that show up. Activation is likely given all of those experiences that folks shared in the chat, and is something that requires some self-compassion and some tenderness to navigate. Another thing that might come up for folks is cognitive dissonance, right? We're sharing information that might differ from the information that is broadly available out there in the world. We're living in toxic diet culture and within the impacts of those systems that I've named, right? And so unlearning all of the messages that we've received about our bodies within those systems is something that is big work and requires a lot of time and care in unpacking for ourselves. And so holding space for cognitive dissonance, for the information that we're receiving to differ from the information we already hold, is really key here. As is being prepared for feelings of guilt and shame that might emerge. So as Christine mentioned, sometimes we become aware that like we've done harm, right? And we might feel quite guilty and ashamed of that harm. We might have done harm to other people. We might do harm to ourselves. And so feeling guilty and ashamed of those things is a really natural response, but one that isn't necessarily super helpful to us. Nor is being really caught up in the grief and loss of recognizing that like the paradigms we've been holding as central may not actually be functional for us. And so having lived a life where you feel like you have to engage in distress and disordered behavior in order to modify your body means that sometimes we've had to give up a bunch of things. As someone with lived experience with distress and disordered eating, that's definitely something that I had to process through. This idea of like the loss that I experienced of all of those years and all of that time that I could have felt comfortable within myself. But I didn't have access to the resources that I needed in order to do so. And so frustration is a really natural thing to come up in response to that. Feeling frustrated that I didn't have access to those resources, to those tools, to those frameworks, to that language in order to understand the experience I was having, to unpack it and resist it, which ultimately, last on there, leads to some disappointment, right? Disappointment that I didn't have access to that information, disappointment that I lost out on experiences that I could have had of joy in my body. And making space for all of that is a challenging thing indeed. And so we want to make sure that we give you some tools, having illustrated some of the feelings that might come up. But I'll throw the ball over to you, Christine, to get us into that.
Go. I was off mute there. So in terms of being able to manage big feelings, something to acknowledge is the fact that we live in a world that often disconnects us from our own feelings and from our own bodies. And something that is important to acknowledge is that our bodies can't tell from the difference between like the harm that we're experiencing versus like the harm that we're doing to ourselves, but that it holds the traumas that show up. It continues to remind us that we need care. So it's important to acknowledge as it shows up, if you can, of course, recognizing that for some folks, you are in the practice of not acknowledging in order to survive in the world. So as it happens, as things are happening, as feelings come up, it's important to acknowledge that they came up. Whether you need to park it to the side and then acknowledge that later, or you do it in the moment, depending on how you process information and feelings, it's important to do that work, to practice that for self-care. And as I said, as the feelings are information, I come from a more so a spiritual practice, also understanding Buddhist psychology, in that we have three hearts: in the head, in our actual heart, and in our gut. And that's usually where I assess whether or not my body is in distress, it's experiencing harm, and from there, feelings can definitely allow us to better understand where we're at. It's then where you can get curious about it to understand where you're at, and then perhaps then be able to name what types of care and support that you might need. Because like I said, this world often gives us so many messaging that doesn't allow us to connect to ourselves. Toxic positivity is certainly one way, a huge way in which that can often just gaslight us, and we learn then to internalize it and then gaslight ourselves and disconnect ourselves from our own bodies. So it's really important to just reflect and perhaps just witness in today's experience if any of those things pop up in your mind of telling yourself, oh, this feeling is just, it happens all the time, but like, it doesn't mean anything for me, or I shouldn't be feeling these feelings. Taking the time to just acknowledge that they came up. You don't have to do anything about it, just to acknowledge, and can often allow your body to find some relief, even if it's a super minute. So it's important to remember those things, and to remember that toxic positivity may very much show up because it's been internalized, and taking that time to just pause and jot it down can be one way to take a step towards and away from toxic positivity and towards connection to our bodies. And another tool that we can definitely use to be able to understand or better understand in those moments of what is coming up for us is to be able to find the words to describe our feelings. And so we want to invite folks to access the feelings wheel. If you want to Google it, you can definitely find very many different versions of the feelings wheel, and just put a name to it, as Sookie has already mentioned with Mr. Rogers' quote here, in that anything mentionable is manageable. Even if it's so big that you feel like you can't personally manage it, this is that if you end up in those places, it means that you probably should. And if you can, reach out to some pals who are supportive, and you can then manage it all together. Sookie and I like to collaborate all the time because we both have really big feelings, and we help each other in that sense to be able to support one another. So this is another tool that you can absolutely access and try to use, especially if you're uncomfortable by having feelings that in those moments you can do something very direct. Um, and then lastly, these are the two feelings that may very much come up in today's conversation. Perhaps you're already arriving with these big feelings here of embarrassment, of anxiety. And we want to acknowledge too that under those big sort of initial feelings, there are more information, and it's great to perhaps look into it, unpack it a little bit more, perhaps today, perhaps another time. So just look at perhaps maybe like some folks are feeling isolated, lonely, self conscious, and that's coming from that initial embarrassment feeling. Or perhaps that you're feeling very stressed, and you're stressed because we live in a pandemic right now. It has not stopped operating, and that you're thinking about having to go into public to get vaccinated, or whatever it may be that is causing for anxiety to live in your body. And so it's important to then unpack that a little bit, and to be able to name it, even if it's just to yourself, to better understand again what your body and what you may be needing in the moment to find some peace from there. I'll throw it back to Sookie for the next one here.
Thanks, Christine. So, in regards to managing big feelings, I think ultimately we want to bring you back to this idea of self compassion, right? Acknowledging that there's a lot of sand in our beach bags to unpack, right? Individually and collectively. And sand in our beach bags is not something we have a heck of a lot of control over, right? If you go to the beach, chances are you're going to end up with some sand in your beach bag. And so it's not your fault that the sand got in there. We can take precautions, but ultimately, like, it's unavoidable. And so, how can we manage the beach bag sand that we have taken on board? How can we expel it from our beach bags? How can we make sure that more sand doesn't get in there? And so, I think this kind of goes back to this idea of toxic positivity that Christine already mentioned, right? We have an illustration here of someone not having a great time navigating the water, and the person on the dock being like, just think about the positives of the situation. Well, having sand in our beach bags is not a super positive experience, right? It gets into everything, it's unpleasant, it scratches up your sunglasses. And so, pretending it's not there isn't going to get us anywhere. It's still going to do that harm. It's going to get all encrusted in the sunscreen. No good, no good at all, right? And so being tender with ourselves when we work to heal and to expel that sand from our beach bags is really important, because it can be a frustrating and challenging process to kind of undertake. And so going back to what Christine was saying, like, we really commend you for being here today and for starting or like being in the middle of advancing a process that you're doing to undertake that work, because getting all of those tiny grains out is something that's definitely possible if we work together and we provide ourselves with the space and the care that we need to do so. So Christine, maybe I'll throw the ball back over to you for the next one.
Thank you. So what we're inviting folks to do, and of course, with the caveat that not everyone can access this today because of lack of resources or lack of the sort of space that you have within yourself, but we're inviting folks to be, if you can access this, befriend your discomfort, learn about it. This is where I'd say that you can really find some parts of the truest form of yourself when you are sitting in the discomfort, to just recognize that there are things that will come up that's uncomfortable, whether that's because you're, again, realizing that you've experienced harm in the past, or perhaps that you're learning something that is challenging to you, that you've really invested your time and energy in believing that that is completely 100% true. And that some of the information we share today may be challenging those things. It's really important to, as you're doing this work of unlearning, unpacking, and then also relearning, that you're definitely going to be uncomfortable, and that it will be helpful to perhaps use it as a learning opportunity, to see where you're at, to see what you need, and access the support and care you need in order to move forward in the conversation. And for some folks, in order to continue your journey of recovery and healing, because sometimes it is really hard to realize that you've experienced harm, but that once you're able to acknowledge that you have, you're more able to then proceed with the tenderness and the care that you need, perhaps both from yourself and then from other folks in your life as well. So asking yourself this question, I often like to just write this down. What information are my feelings telling me right now? What do I need? Those are the great ways to better understand and care for yourself in the moment, and also to then tell folks and draw some boundaries too, if you need to say, listen, this is not a conversation I can engage in right now. For some folks, that may mean that that you need to take a break from this webinar, stepping away, coming back. All of those things are very valid and good to do when you feel like your body needs a break from this conversation. So throwing it back to Sookie for the next part here.
Thanks, Christine. So what we want to invite you to do is to take a moment to think about what care looks, sounds, and feels like for you while doing this work. Just a couple of points that come up for you around how we can care for ourselves and how we can care for one another. So there's lots of suggestions that I think we can share, but also acknowledging that there's lots of great knowledge in the room already. You're also welcome to drop any suggestions you might have into the chat so that you can share them with others as well. So as you're writing them down, I'll share a few strategies that Christine and I wanted to suggest. First and foremost, a reminder in that graphic that beating yourself up is an abuse of power. So again, exercising some self-compassion and some tenderness is really key here in providing the space that we deserve, right? We have a right to in doing hard work. And so please be kind to yourself as you're doing so. Something that might be helpful is to write down a list of words using your feelings wheel to be able to better describe the experience that you're having, taking some deep breaths to release some tension can be helpful. I know that I certainly, as an anxiety cat, often forget to breathe. It seems like a very straightforward thing that my body should be doing on its own, but sometimes when we're feeling tense, that is something that can be forgotten. And so taking deep breaths can help. As can finding some physical release, ideally rooted in humor, recognizing that moving our bodies can be activating in and of itself. And so there's some tools that I wanted to share with you that I find really helpful that I refer to as huffing calisthenics. And the reason I refer to them that way is because they are based on that title at least is based on this like very strange video from the early 1900s that I saw on the BBC archive featuring 3 young white women wearing what appeared to be nightgowns, but I'm pretty sure were just the fashion of the time, engaged in some calisthenics. And one of the ones they did was something that looked somewhat like this, which was and I thought it was so funny because they were very huffy. And so that's why I call them huffing calisthenics. And so the first one comes from my partner. And what he encourages me to do and does himself in dealing with anxiety is just to wiggle. So if you're feeling anxious or feeling overwhelmed, just giving yourself a little wiggle can be a helpful thing to do. We'll invite you to do that at any point over the course of the webinar that big feelings are coming up. Another is very applicable to what we're undertaking today in regards to beach bodies, and it also comes from my partner, and it's referred to as on a tropical island. And what you do for this one is you close your eyes and you imagine that you are a palm tree on a tropical island. You can even sing to yourself, as I often do, on a tropical island, on a tropical island, and you just sway in the breeze. You can put your arms up like Christine is doing. You can put your arms down. Trees know no bounds. So whatever kind of palm tree type configuration you would like to put your body in, go for it and just sway with the breeze. The next one is referred to as the plant and grunt. So what you do is you get really centered into your hips. You can stand up, you can sit down, whatever feels good for you. I'm on an exercise ball chair, which is important information in case this whole time you've been like, why is Sookie at C? Because I bounce a little bit. Anyway, so what you do is you get into your hips, you throw your head back and you go, huh, as many times or as few times as you need to release that tension. Finally, and perhaps my favorite of all, is the A&P, which is based on the name of a grocery store chain that was very popular and very around in the 90s when I was growing up. And they had this commercial where an employee of their store went into another grocery store and was making announcements for A&P and was discovered by an employee of that store. And the end of the commercial is that person, the A&P employee, running across the parking lot of this other grocery store going, A&P, 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 which I think is very hilarious and hard to do without laughing, because ultimately, like, running with your arms in the air is not a very ergonomic strategy. And so if at any point you're overwhelmed over the course of the time we have together today, or any time at all, huffing calisthenics are in your corner to help with that physical release rooted in humor that might be helpful in making some space for those very challenging feelings that might come up. So what we'll invite you to do at this point is to engage a little bit with the specific topic of hand, which is this idea of going to the beach. And so what I'm going to do is I'm going to read out some statements. And what I want you to think about and maybe take notes about if you have paper at hand is some of the feelings that come up for you as I read out these statements. Recognizing again that the feelings might be big. If there's a statement that you're like, whoa, ruh-roh, activated, compassion really key, and you have the huffing calisthenics in your corner. So statement number 1. What kind of feelings come up for you when you think about walking into cool, clear lake water in your favorite swimming spot? Give you a moment to think about those feelings. Cool, clear lake water in your favorite swimming spot. What about when you think about running across a hot beach to get in the water? Running across a hot beach to get in the water. Ouch, my toesies. Lounging in the shade with a cool breeze blowing across your skin. Lounging in the cool breeze blowing across your skin. Rinsing sand off your feet under a cool outdoor faucet, hose, or shower. Getting rid of those little sand particles from your feet in that cool water. Pulling a nice cold drink out of a cooler full of ice and taking a sip. Great demonstration, Christine. Thank you. Trying on a swimsuit. Trying on a swimsuit. putting on a swimsuit and going to the beach. Putting on a swimsuit and going to the beach. Walking down the beach in a cover up or your clothes to find a spot to set up your towel or blanket, or take in the sights and sounds of the shore. Walking back to your beach blanket after a refreshing swim without a cover up. So walking back to your beach blanket after a refreshing swim without a cover up. Wrapping yourself in a soft, sun-warmed towel to dry off. So, having heard that list of potential experiences in going to the beach, Christine, can I ask you to go to the next one? Want to now cue you to think about those feelings that came up through that lens of curiosity we're encouraging you to use. So, putting a name to them, what kinds of feelings came up if you're looking at a feelings wheel? How would you describe them? Were some of the feelings more or less challenging than others? And if so, were there any patterns in how challenging particular experiences looked or felt? So for example, did you feel a lot of challenging feelings when I talked about the experience of like being seen on the beach, right? Going back to your towel after a swim. Were there challenging feelings that came up in relation to the idea of like swimsuits specifically and trying them on or going outside of the house in them? Were there some patterns in regards to the feelings that you experienced as like maybe more positive? So that might be related to like the feeling of like cool water or warm sun. So really going through a process, having experienced those feelings and hearing the statements, of getting curious about them and the information that they're providing. So I'm seeing in the chat here that that folks were experiencing things like anxiety, for example, concerns around self-esteem and self-confidence, not feeling the approval of others in regards to how we look and feeling rejected, rejecting ourselves as a result and wanting to be invisible. Sometimes I joke that my experience of my gender is that I do not wish to be perceived. My gender, please do not perceive me. So like, that's a really valid experience that many of us are having if our bodies have been made to feel unsafe, for sure. So we wanted to provide you with an opportunity to practice dealing with those big feelings before we dive into some of the more challenging parts of the conversation we wanted to have today. And at this point, I'm going to throw the ball over to you, Christine, to get us into one of those challenging conversations.
So we're going to switch gears just a little bit, or I guess continuously move us along into the next portion of today's webinar, which is to navigate body negativity. And that we wanted to start off with that with a Cara Rossetti campaign called the Women Project. And it's a series of posters, photos that you can definitely access online that goes far beyond just body image related experiences and more so just experiences of like womanhood of women. And as you can see in the link in the chat, rather, you can definitely check those out later on. But for this moment right now, we'd like to invite folks to just perhaps focus on the top portion of those posters right now and just take a moment and do a quick read of what it says there. And from there, we'll ask a question next around what the messages may potentially mean and also where they may be coming from. And we'll explore those a little bit more. So I'll give folks perhaps a minute or two to go through that. Okay, so I will move us along from here. And there's another one here as well. And put in the prompt that is, what messages about their bodies are the people in these images receiving? So taking the context out of it, what do you think ultimately are these messaging telling people? What may they be potentially internalizing? Feel free to drop that into the chat. I'm seeing in the chat here by Kelly that people should feel shameful about their bodies, that their bodies aren't good enough, that certain bodies are more appropriate, quote unquote, than others. Absolutely. Feelings of being unworthy, that it's about other people and not yourself, that yes, for sure, being centered around how others are receiving you. Messages that bodies are something to be ashamed of, for sure. And those are really hard messaging to like take in, that it is worth to be shown as people are disgust, so like the feelings of disgust by others about your body, that is so hard to experience, for sure. So what folks have essentially shared in the chat here is really the messaging that comes from body negativity, or rather the body negativity that ends up being internalized, for all of the bodies that were referenced in those posters, but also for all of us too, right? Even if we're not directly impacted by it, in witnessing those messaging can very much be impacting how we see ourselves as well. And so we wanted to explore this concept of body negativity as essentially the root of the violence that so many people experience, and especially in thinking about having a body in the public and being visible, and understanding that for whatever reason, that some bodies are better than others, and that by virtue of that, it means that we must feel bad about our own bodies, and that it encourages us to then place judgment that doesn't serve anyone, besides, as Sookie has mentioned in the past, like white supremacy, patriarchy, capitalism, and colonialism. And it doesn't actually serve anybody at large. And that it also leads to body terrorism. And that's definitely something we'll dive into a little bit more later on. But that it, of course, through policing and shaming, that there's violence in that, inherent in those actions. And it certainly goes far beyond body size and weight, and that this feeds into a system that often hurts us. So this is essentially what I just went through. On the slide, I forgot to click next. Apologies. And so this summarizes what body negativity essentially is. Of course, obviously, our experiences may differ from one another, but that it is very, at the end, ultimately, at the end of the day, it's the messaging that feeds into our bodies that make us feel a certain way, and oftentimes it makes us feel very bad because it's violence that really breaches all of the internal core boundaries that we have as humans, in terms of accessing needs that we have, and also the support that we could potentially access if it weren't for body negativity that exists in the world. Another way to unpack, or perhaps to further this conversation here about body negativity, is certainly to acknowledge that all of us experience having a body very differently too. And it's important to acknowledge that social location certainly plays a large role into understanding what types of body negativity experiences that we then are subjected to. And a quick sort of notion of what social location is, or definition, is the idea that based on how we are born into the world, the types of access that we have to different resources, whether that's material or in terms of personally, in terms of our own identities, how we identify, how we're seen by the world, all of those things certainly impact what it is essentially what social location is. It positions us in society in a particular way. So as you can see in this graphic here, there's different circles all around that speaks to different identities, and that all ties into the influencing factors of how we experience, potentially how we experience body negativity. And in making sure that we have some information to put it into context, I'll share a little bit about myself using this graphic here. And also introduce the concept of intersectionality here by Dr. Kimberly Crenshaw, who at the time it came up with this term to be able to better speak to experiences of Black women in the workforce, specifically in the context of understanding the experiences of sexism and racism at the same time, simultaneously, being able to then name it and address those two systems of oppression simultaneously. So it's really important that we take an intersectional approach to this as well, because we certainly cannot divide ourselves into all of the different identities that we hold, that most oftentimes when marginalization happens, it happens simultaneously. So for me, it is really easy for folks to target me based on my race, and certainly that's not the only identifier that puts me in a vulnerable position, but that it is the first thing, one of the first things that people notice. But what I can say in how I'm positioned is that being a non-binary person, certainly people misunderstand my gender all the time, but also, like I mentioned earlier in my introduction, that within sort of the identity category of body size, I experience privilege. So it really means that I am certainly not absolved of the ability to do harm to other folks, even though I do experience harm very often. So it's important to, again, like I said, take the intersectional approach to this conversation and better understanding how we take up space, or how we're forced to not take up space, and that we are minoritized in a lot of the different conversations here. So that's one way to apply social location and intersectionality into understanding experiences of body negativity. My skin tone, for sure, is often where I am targeted, where I get messaging around that my skin tone is too dark and that I must do things to change it, when I, of course, cannot change it other than make it darker by hanging out in the sun very naturally. And I enjoy doing that, but oftentimes that means that my experience of being racialized can often be amplified even more so in the summertime, because I get darker in the summertime. So that's one example there where, again, using this graphic of speaking to race being centered, that I can experience body negativity also even just within my own sort of year-to-year experiences, that from wintertime to summertime, that shifts immediately. So that's one example of looking at this in terms of unpacking some of those concepts and understanding some of my own some of your own experiences, perhaps, and thinking about where you have access to some extra supports or resources, and where you may not have access, and perhaps you need more support in better unpacking those experiences. And I'll throw it over to Sookie to perhaps share a different perspective and complement this portion.
Thanks, Christine. So if I think about my own experience with my social location in regards to intersectionality, what's been most central to me is my experience of body size in relation to moving through the world in a fat body. And it's really important for me to understand that experience in relation to both the ways in which that experience is kind of configured around the other aspects of my identity, and the ways in which it has been impacted by my access in regards to power and privilege. And so when I think about body size for myself as it intersects with my racial identity as a white settler, it's really important for me to understand that the experiences of fat phobia and sizeism that I have are not experiences that are also simultaneously of racism. Many of my Black, Indigenous, people of color friends, when they talk to me about their experiences of sizeism and fat phobia, communicate that like those experiences are very much through a racialized lens. And so both of those types of violence are happening simultaneously. And what that means in regards to my own work and my own understanding of my fat body is that in conversations around fat phobia and sizeism, it's important important for me to leverage my white privilege in order to amplify the voices of BIPOC folks who are doing this work. You'll notice that we've made an effort to do so wherever possible, recognizing that like we're only two people having this conversation, right? And there's other voices that are participating in it and doing incredible work. It's also important for me to understand the impact that my access to education has had on my ability to engage with this topic. So my understanding of fat phobia and sizeism has definitely been configured by my access to university level education at the master's level, right? I have access to language and to tools and to frameworks to understand the violences that impact my life, and to be able to unpack them for myself, to externalize what otherwise would be internalized, and to help assist other folks in understanding those experiences and putting language to those experiences so that we can collectively heal from them. Also important for me to understand that my relationship with body size is also something that's impacted by my relationship with my gender and attraction. As a non-binary queer person, I have access to queer community and to trans community, where conversations about body liberation are perhaps a little bit more common than they are outside of those spaces. And so I'm able to be affirmed in this work and in this healing for myself in a way that perhaps I wouldn't be if I wasn't a queer and non-binary person. But that being said, those are things that also impact the way in which I experience fat phobia and sizeism. There's a lot of pressure as a fat person to perform a particular type of gender as a feminine person. So it took a really long time, for example, for me to grow out my facial hair, even though in the absence of any HRT or hormone replacement therapy, that's just something that my body naturally does. But as someone who also has a lot of physical characteristics that are attributed to femininity in our social context, there's been a lot of pressure on me in my life to be as feminine as possible, because there's much more space for a fat body that is understandable within a binary gender lens than there is for one that's outside of it. And so I think it's really important for me to also acknowledge and understand that like my experience as a non-binary person is going to impact how I experience fat phobia and sizeism. For lots of trans and non-binary people, modifying our bodies or changing our bodies to fit into the scripts of gender that exist in our cultural and social setting within this colonial context is something that is a matter of safety, right? And so having access to the knowledge to understand how to engage with my body in a way that like allows me to access safety and recognizes the ways in which I can't, again, to go back to what Christine was saying, is really central to how intersectionality is going to impact the way in which I can do this work. And that also, if I could ask you the next one, Christine, applies to like my particular experience of fatness. So what you can see here is a graphic from Fluffy Kitten Party that illustrates some of the different categories. I am someone who has moved through the world in the range of small fat to infinifat, respectively, depending on the part of my life and how my body has changed. And so the range of experiences that I'm having are impacted by that particular experience, because weight stigma is something that impacts all of us differently, because there is a range of different experiences that folks are having, because fat phobia looks different depending on the body size that we have and the specificities of that body size. And so ultimately it's important, if I could ask you to the next one, Christine, for me to understand how like that reality means that sometimes my body fits less or better than it would in other instances. And this is a great graphic for understanding that idea of fitting. We have a circle here on the other side of a circular hole saying, if you want to get through, just be yourself, to a bunch of other shapes who are not circular. And that really gets to the heart of the issue, right? The world is configured to be kinder, to exert care and respect towards particular types of bodies, and is not necessarily configured for all of the bodies that we happen to have. And that impacts the experience that we have as we're moving through the world. I'll throw the ball back over to you, Christy, at this point.
Thanks, Sookie. And so, as an example, I am definitely somebody who can very much be that circle when I step into the spaces of thinking about movement, of thinking about having a body. As if I were to be working in schools as a phys ed teacher, I can easily say, well, you know, just try this thing, try this sport, because I was good at it, so you must be good at it. And I, was fortunate enough growing up in an environment where yes, I did excel in sports. And I was also noticing that my pals weren't having a good time, and that I was noticing other folks in my life who were constantly experiencing violence. And I realized like that, what, there's a wall that exists here that makes it easier for me to navigate through. Whereas for other folks, it's very, very hard. If anything, for many folks, they just simply cannot go through it. There are many other walls in the way as well. And so that requires the work of being able to reflect and then observe and think outside of my own experiences. And it's important to be able to see that both for the folks who are experiencing the harm and seeing the wall, just to notice that there is a wall, and it's not because of you inherently that you can't access a certain thing, but because there are other external forces that exist. And unfortunately, it's oftentimes jocks and folks like myself that upholds those walls by gaslighting or by saying things that doesn't work for all other people. And so this is something that certainly when I see this graphic here in this context here, I'm very conscious of naming for many folks, especially who are not moving through the world in a larger body, that, perhaps thinking about how we take up space by being able to benefit from thin privilege or any other types of privileges, right? That can often uphold this type of rhetoric. So with that said, we wanted to return back to the Cara Rossetti project posters here, and want to invite folks to read this one that says, and I'll just read this out loud. After 5 years of fighting against her body, Joanna managed to wear a bikini at the beach. And Joanna had a really good time and realized she doesn't need to change her body to feel good. And we wanted to pose a couple questions for you folks. If you want to just write these down, simply, or just take the moment to kind of reflect on it. You don't have to share in the chat. Which is how does hearing body negative messages impact our ability to access fun in the sun? And a second question is, how does accessing supportive messages around our bodies impact our ability to access fun in the sun? So just to be able to sit with those questions here, just take a moment and think about that. And if you like to go a step further in terms of unpacking this image here, imagine what types of messages did Joanna hear in order to come to that realization that she doesn't need to change her body to feel good? A couple of those questions to ponder on. And perhaps if you can, I invite you to sit with those questions as we go into the next portions here around body terrorism, and really unpacking some of these external forces that Sookie and I have been talking about in the last little bit. I'll throw it back to Sookie here.
Thanks, Christine. So ultimately, body terrorism impacts our access, right? It limits our access to resources that we need to meet our material needs, our emotional needs, our social needs. If you think about material needs, that includes things like comfortable swimming attire, right? That's appropriate for our needs around like covering our bodies in particular ways, of expressing our gender in particular ways. Emotional needs, that includes things like access to the joy of warm sun and cool water on our skin without experiencing or being subjected to violence on the beach. And often folks are like, what do you mean by violence? And that is a complicated question because I think sometimes we think about violence as exclusively verbal or physical, and that's not exactly the case. It includes things like that, which would be framed as like macroaggressions, but also microaggressions, right? Folks communicating in a way that reinforces diet culture, commenting on our bodies, for example, or giving us like sidelong glances or cut eye would be included in that idea of microaggressions, which ties into social needs, right? The need to be able to access social inclusion and not feel excluded from plans or social spaces like trips to the beach. Which can feel really challenging if we're having those experiences of violence when we do so. So when it comes to how social domination works, it's important to understand that it is a relational process, which you can see illustrated here in this pyramid diagram. So we're living our lives within institutions that are giving us messages about what is and is not permitted, what is and is not valid and valuable when it comes to embodiment. Those are communicated to us through our interpersonal relationships with characters in television shows, with people in our lives directly in various types of intimate relationships, whether that be with family members, with friends, with romantic or sexual partners, with folks who are representatives of institutions like teachers, doctors, actors in shows, as already mentioned. All of these are interpersonal relationships where those messages are being communicated. And we then in turn internalize these messages, and they come to impact how we conceive of and perceive ourselves and the world around us. And through that internalization, we then parrot those messages back out through our interpersonal relationships, further reinforcing those institutional messages, right, by repeating them and by reinforcing them in those relational settings. So we'd love to talk through just a quick example of what that can look like. So this on the next slide here, you'll see one of our favorite cartoons for having this conversation. Which is this lovely robot here who has come upon a cosmopolitan magazine and has in that magazine learned that something is wrong with their body. And this is a great paired graphic, I think, because it really speaks to how through kind of this commoditization of body positivity, often there's some mixed messages happening in these publications. So inside of the magazine, you can see there that there's this really body positive message of like, you know, everyone can wear swimsuits, but on the cover, we're seeing reinforced that like ultimately it is a privilege that should be accorded to only a particular type of body. And so really confusing messaging that this robot's receiving potentially from this Cosmo magazine, as are any of us if we're reading commercial publications that are focused on the topics that are included in things like fashion or style magazines like that one. So if we talk through kind of what the impacts look like in that triangle on the next slide, that might help us understand a little bit better. Can I ask you? Perfect, thanks, Christine. So, so what we see illustrated here is that process, right? The robot is learning lots of things about what it means to be in their body by reading that magazine. So we have the robot, engaging with a beauty magazine that is aimed at feminine people. I don't know what the robot's gender is, but that's the context of the magazine. That magazine was written by a human person living in a similar cultural context. From that magazine, the robot is learning that fat is something that should be considered ugly, and that being ugly or fat is something that they should feel upset about, which leads to, in pink there, the robot feeling bad about themselves and getting upset, interpersonally, then lashing out, potentially harming themselves and others, and definitely causing massive lab damage, which institutionally means that the robot is unable to participate in advancing science, and the experiment is halted and progress is hindered for us all. So some pretty ready impacts there. So I wanted to share a little bit about my own experience in my body in relation to body terrorism. I am someone who, as I mentioned in my introduction, has spent a lot of my life in a swimsuit. I'm a little bit of a water baby. And so I entered the water at a very young age. I grew up in Sarnia, which is adjacent to Lake Huron, the greatest of the lakes in my opinion. And so my mom really prioritized getting me into swimming lessons because it was a matter of safety given how much water was around. And so she enrolled me in swimming lessons when I was 6 months old. And I really took to them like a fish to water, and really have remained quite devoted to swimming throughout my life, in a kiddie pool in the backyard and in the lake. Really, as a kid, it was hard to get me to wear anything other than my swimsuit in the summer, which you can see illustrated here, for a whole variety of activities, whether that be harassing the cat, which is for another training in regards to the wonderful lessons cats can teach us about consent, whether that was playing on the swim set or climbing on equipment or eating some birthday cake. My swimsuit was my outfit of choice. And I didn't think much in that moment of my life about like what other people thought about my swimsuited little body. That changed as I aged, unfortunately. If I can ask you to go to the next one, Christine. So this is a collection of images from family trips. We spent a lot of time in the pool. And in the first one, you can see me there with my grandma having a good swim in our matching bathing caps. And in that moment in my life, I don't remember feeling any kind of like body drama or any apprehension about going in the pool. However, in the other picture, you can see me reaching puberty. And I remember very viscerally how I felt in this picture, which was uncomfortable. My body had started to change. My family members were still like playing with me in the same way. And like, I was still having like a fun time, but like, I was really conscious that like other humans in the pool area on this family vacation were like looking at my body and maybe finding it lacking and feeling like increasingly uncomfortable, which increased over the course of my coming into adulthood. And so in one of these pictures here, you can see me in my first ever two-piece swimsuit, which was a tankini when tankinis first became commercially available. And I remember distinctly the feeling I had in this picture as well. So I'm with two of my peers, and when I look at it now, I can see that our bodies are not all that dissimilar, but this was the height of my own experience of distress and disordered eating. And I definitely did not perceive the commonality between our bodies. I felt very uncomfortable in that swimsuit. And the only reason I was wearing it is because like, it was fashion and I wanted to be fashionable in my 14-year-old body. On the other side, you can see me at a swim meet. I was the captain of my swim team and I am pulling a very strange pose because I felt deeply uncomfortable. Some family members had come to watch my swim meet and they were taking pictures through the window and I was like, please do not perceive me. And so I'm going to do the robot and that is going to dissuade people from noticing that I have a body that is in a swimsuit right now. Because ultimately, like, whilst that other swimsuit was for fashion, this swimsuit in the swim meet was for functionality, and no one was to look at me in it because I was just there to do my competition. And so I felt really mad that the picture was being taken. In those moments in my life, I absolutely didn't ever think that I would be comfortable being in public in a swimsuit. And I definitely felt like my most favorite activity of swimming was a little bit less accessible to me because I couldn't just go to the lake and enjoy the sand and the surf because I was really hyper aware that people were perceiving me and I did not like it one bit. So I ask you the next one there, Christine. That has changed over the course of my life. What you can see on this slide is some really important images to me, both of which were taken by two of my best friends. The one in the bright green bikini, top and black bottoms, was taken by one of my best friends at the first ever No Lose conference that I attended, and it was my first time ever wearing a full bikini in public. Now, No Lose is a gathering of fat folks and our allies, specifically who identify as queer and trans, and it is an experience to say the very least. It is the first time and perhaps the only time in my life that I was in a space that was like fat centered. And part of that event was a pool party. And at that pool party, my bestie encouraged me to wear the bikini that I had brought with me. And this is the picture that they took for me of myself in the bikini before we went to the pool party. And I am having a great time just knowing that going to this pool party in this bikini is something that I'm going to be able to do. And that experience empowered me to reclaim space and joy in my body, which I then later built on by asking my other best friend, who is a professional photographer, to take some pictures of my mom and myself on a beach day, which you can see illustrated in this other image on this slide. The idea that I would be sharing publicly pictures of myself in a two-piece swimsuit is something that my 14-year-old very unwell self could never have even imagined. But these are solidly two of my favorite pictures of myself. I really love the one on the beach, especially because whoever designed this swimsuit was like very into celebrating larger bodies and was like, you know what, I'm not gonna add some minimizing to this swimsuit, I'm gonna maximize. And so they added some ruffles to the hips, and I'm really pleased by that choice, as you can see in this picture. And so if I think about this experience that I've just talked through for folks within that triangle, you can hear that there were some messages that I internalized at a certain point in my life as I was going into puberty that made me feel really uncomfortable in my body, right? Through the interpersonal relationships, the interactions I was having in space with strangers in regards to that family trip pool story. And that those really made me feel at odds and not at ease in my body. And so really unpacking those things is a matter of addressing them at all three of those levels, right? Of having access to community, to interpersonal relationships where I was affirmed through that no loose community, which allowed me to challenge those institutional messages and to externalize them, to heal, and to no longer be limited in my ability to access the wonders of wearing my frilly fruited bathing suit out there on the beach and having a great old time. And so ultimately, I think it's important for me to acknowledge that like that was a lengthy process that was impacted by, if I can ask you to the next one, Christine, the world in which I'm living and the messages I was receiving about my body. And so this is one of my favorite cartoons to talk about my experience as a non-binary person. As I mentioned before, I'm someone who like is often perceived as having too much gender in a way that's confusing for other people. And so if we live in a system where I'm presented with two hats, I'm like, no, thank you. I do not wish for those hats. I would like a large rainbow hat, right? I like a big hat, as you learned at the start of this webinar. And so I think it's important to acknowledge that like that's a really challenging thing to do, right? To say like, I'm hearing all these messages about what I'm supposed to do, I'm being shoulded all over, but like actually unsubscribe. I am not going to participate in that because it's making me feel bad. This seems like it might not be the best approach to experiencing my body. And so understanding that within a systemic cultural context, I think is really, really important. And that's what these two wonderful tweets really allow us to focus on. So like, you know, if I understood my uncomfortability in a swimsuit as a matter of insecurity, that would be too personalized for what's actually happening. Actually, it's not insecurity that's behind it, as you can see Bunny Michael referring to here. It's a conditioned system of belief that's intent on perpetuating our disempowerment. And every time that we're able to break out of that, we're superheroes, because ultimately, like, it's a very challenging thing to do. And it's a challenging thing to do because it's supposed to be, and intentionally a challenging thing to do. And so if we can find support in doing so, that's really key. The other tweet you can see here from brilliant Caleb Luna is that ultimately these systems are rooted in systems of ongoing violence, right? That are the result of like 500 years of Western colonization, that have really held as central the importance of white supremacy, capitalism, and patriarchy as like the deciding factor of what is and is not appropriate embodiment. And so those are big things for us to be resisting and refusing to participate in. And so if it feels like big challenging work, it's because it is, which goes back to why it's so important for it to not be individual work, but rather for it to be collective and community care centered work, because we're unpacking quite a lot. And if we're able to do that together, it's much more likely that we're going to have success and be able to access frilly bathing suits to our heart's content, if we so desire. I'll throw the ball back over to you, Christine, to get us into strategies for resistance.
Thanks, Sookie. So in going into strategies for resistance, I'm also recognizing that this is a very long webinar. So if you want to take a moment just to like kind of wiggle it out as I go into the next portion here, please feel free to just readjust, shift. I certainly do that a lot because you know what, having a body is hard, and it's important to just kind of recenter ourselves as we sit through this conversation here. So to continue along, we wanted to acknowledge that like this is a lot to take on, like, as Suki has already mentioned, right? It's a lot of work. And so let's break it down in a couple steps to get us started here. And the first one is to really be thinking about how can we resist body terrorism, because it is happening every day in pretty much every moment of our lives with the messaging that we consume. And so it starts off with by recognizing like what makes you feel good or neutral and what makes you feel not so good, and unpacking our feelings and in terms of how that is telling us and giving us messages. So for some folks, you may be really uncomfortable with your feelings. Just imagine that as like text messages that you're receiving, and using that as a way to say, oh, wait, there's a notification that's telling me that's not so good. And then getting curious about them when you have that space to do so. Asking yourself, where did they come from? Who's sending me these text messages? What are they telling us about our needs and limitations? Um, and and then, you know, if you can, especially for the folks here today, you're already here accessing more support, finding supportive community, connecting with people who are in alignment with your values, with your work. Perhaps that you can do your healing work and recovery work together with people, and you don't have to do that alone. You know, finding all of those communities and spaces for you to, even if it's to read articles, to watch whatever is on Netflix or TV shows that really give you those messages that resist against those not so good and violent messaging that we receive all the time. And then from there, building out some more strategies to think about what healing looks like for you, because it's going to look very different, sound and feel different for folks, and to be able to then map out the tools and strategies that you can build upon as you continue with your journey there. So I'm going to pause there and I'll throw it over to Suki to keep us going.
Thanks, Christine. So also important is recognizing that like the beauty standards that are impacting us within diet culture are ever shifting and changing. And so what you can see here are some vintage advertisements for products that are meant to bring about changes in weight. In one of them, we see folks being encouraged to not be so skinny because they won't be attractive. In the other, we can see folks being encouraged not to be so fat because they won't be attractive. And really in the third, it's quite blatantly stated why folks should care, which is the idea of being attractive within patriarchy to specifically men. And so if we can understand the ways in which beauty standards are configured as impacted by patriarchy, capitalism, and white supremacy, that provides us with a tool to be able to resist internalizing those messages, right? To be critical of them in a way that we otherwise might not have access to, because ultimately advertisements are things that are part of our daily lives because we live in a consumerist culture within capitalism. I could ask you the next one, Christine. And so ads like these are types of ads that we're still subjected to. Here you can see an ad for a protein powder that states, "Are you beach body ready?" which is holding up a particular type of white, feminine, cisgender body as kind of one that we should all be working to attain. You can see a response to that ad from another company as part of the Dove Real Beauty campaign, which says, "Yes, we are beach body ready." Which again is challenging that idea, but is still wrapped up in that consumerism, right? Body positivity being used to sell us products. And so ultimately, like resisting any of these systems that attribute value to participation in an economic system, for example, or in white supremacy or patriarchy is pretty central insofar as it allows us to claim space in our bodies in a way that doesn't center those systems or reproduce them. And so you know, the Dove Real Beauty campaign is an excellent kind of counter to much of the body negativity that's out there, and you can see that they're using their platform to directly counter this protein powder ad, but also still important to recognize that like that's still part of capitalism, and we don't need to necessarily buy something to feel better in our own skin, or we shouldn't have to buy something to feel better in our own skin. So I'm gonna ask you the next one, Christine. Going back to our strategies for resistance. Just wanted to center this graphic here, which is the idea that like we don't need to work on our bikini bodies. other people who are making comments and holding as true that a particular body only has right to access sand and surf and the fun in the sun means that they need to work on their bikini minds, which I think really goes back to the idea of how really at the heart of this work is unpacking those internalized messages, right? We're much less likely to judge others or to pass judgment on the bodies we see around us if we stop judging ourselves in alignment with these standards that we've been taught through these systems. And so providing ourselves with that space is a kindness and part of the way in which we can recognize and unpack our feelings. So with that being said, I'll throw the ball back over to you, Christine, for the next one.
Thanks, Sookie. So in furthering along the conversation around healing, that's also a lot of the work that I try and ground movement practices in thinking about what healing centered practice is for myself and also for other folks as well that went in terms of my work. And then a lot of it has to do with practicing radical acceptance. So accepting yourself in the moment, to be present, is really hard work, but it's really important to recognize that for some folks, maybe body neutrality, being neutral, feeling indifferent about your body is as far as you go because of the history of traumas that you've experienced and potentially continue to experience. For some folks, it's accessing being able to be vulnerable, being honest with yourself, and then being honest with other people around you and saying, I'm not feeling great, or I need support, I need help, or I've been doing harm to myself without even realizing that I have. That also includes, then practicing self-compassion, to then say, like, yeah, I mean, this is where I am, this is my reality, this is my truth. And is it where I want to be? Maybe not. But accepting where you are can really allow you to then take steps to move and have movement towards where you want to be and where you desire to be. And that definitely is one way to center your healing practices, the ways in which you access supports for that, and to also then look at grouping up, right? Like I said, I'm all about interdependence, working together with people, collaborating, having conversations, and then through doing that, you can connect with people, all of which is really, it comes back to the idea that healing can very much be done more so within a community and understanding what collective community care is versus doing all of this on your own. And in doing so, that you can then reclaim or claim back your bodily autonomy. For some people, that might look like sending selfies of yourself into a group chat that will then hype you up and like build up your own hype team. It's usually what I call that. That whatever you sent into that space, that virtual space, that you're definitely going to get positive messages back, right? Or if maybe you're having hard feelings and you share it and they can perhaps support you in those moments, or say, you know what, that's really hard. I see you struggling. And in those moments, that's where the connection and beauty of being able to connect and access healing. And obviously, of course, when it comes down to it, fighting a system means that you're going to need some support too in resisting all of the body terrorism messaging that comes our way. That it requires a full team, a full team effort to be able to fight it, as opposed to just individually experiencing all of this harm on our own. And you can see as a graphic on the side there that you can certainly be creative about it too, right? And as you think through sort of being able to access, go to the beach, and to have a body, to wear whatever you'd like to wear, to feel good in it. There's also so many other ways in which that we can access that sense of feeling, that positive feeling, by being creative. And that's one way to also approach this work, is to just be as innovative as much as possible, because the external systems that we've already talked about are actually quite boring and unoriginal. So that's another way to essentially access joy in doing this work. Another way to do this is, of course, to look at what body liberation is, accessing frameworks and understanding of information that can inform us of the different ways in which we can practice healing and finding spaces that are cathartic and positive and neutral for us. And so we'll quickly go into what body liberation is here and as a framework, as a tool. And it's really important to name that body liberation work is related and also informed by all of the different social justice and liberation movements that has been taking place simultaneously, in that gender justice, reproductive justice, queer and trans liberation, decolonization, disability justice, fat liberation, racial justice, environmental justice, and more, all feeds into liberating the body, because we all have a body, and it's a matter of recognizing what types of work needs to be at the center to address the different ways in which that our bodies are being often subjected to violence. And for many folks, all of these different social justice movements are just as important, because, like I said earlier, with with the intersectional approaches, that we often simultaneously experience all of those systemic oppressions. And it's important to recognize that a lot of this work also has been started by folks who have been doing all of these different types of justice work in having a body, that it isn't just one person or one particular body that started this liberation work. And so, what is body liberation about? What is this framework? It is all about, it comes down to resisting and finding resilience in that resistance work. Believing that we're all captains of our own underpants, that no one else should ever be making decisions about our bodies but us. And that it's the idea that all bodies and all people are valuable, and that we all hold value, and it's important that we are given the messaging and shown that we deserve access to respect and well-being, and that in having a body in this world, that it is important to then challenge those body negativity, whatever it may be, however it manifests, as it comes up, that we then have support and ways of connecting with folks and ourselves that can feel good. And I'll throw it over to Sookie to unpack some of those different tree trunks that we like to use to talk about body liberation.
Thanks, Christine. So we're not going to take a deep dive into the sturdy trunks of body liberation today. You can find that information in previous webinars that Christine and I have led on the Sheena's Place YouTube channel, but we will just quickly touch on them. So in our work, we use this body liberation framework of these 4 sturdy trunks, including autonomy, non-judgment, body neutrality, and validation and celebration. And the reason we use, if I could ask you the next one, Christine, tree-based metaphor here is that trees have a lot to teach us about body liberation in regards to how they coexist together. So trees are supportive beings for one another when they exist in groves of trees together. Do you mind going to the next one, Christine? Perfect, thank you. So when they exist in groves of together, they support one another's well-being. There's been findings that in groves of same species trees, there are cases where if one of the trees is cut off at the trunk, the other trees in the grove share resources through their root systems to keep that de-canopied tree alive, often for decades at a time. And so that ethic of care is one that we can take a lesson from, as is the way in which trees give one another space through the phenomenon of crown shyness. They leave a little bit of space around their crown, their leaves, in order to not block one another's access to the resources they need to grow in order to photosynthesize. And so there's lots of wisdom, which you can also see illustrated in these graphics, that we can take from trees and plants in regards to their experience of embodiment and coexistence. But those ultimately relate to the lessons that we find in the sturdy trunks of body liberation. So really going to the next slide, Christine, thanks. Going to that idea of body autonomy, right? How do we claim autonomy in our bodies? How do we resist these systems in order to have access to the resources we need? How can we practice non-judgment to allow ourselves the space to exist in the skin we're in through the practice of body neutrality, not feeling pressure to feel positively about ourselves in an instance where like that might feel really inaccessible based on the like level of violence that we're experiencing on a day-to-day basis. Validating the experiences that we're actually having instead of pretending they're not happening, and finding ways to celebrate ourselves and one another in the skin that we're in as we exist in this moment. Which brings us to the next slide here, which is this idea that like it can be really challenging to do this work, right? It can be really challenging to feel comfortable in a swimsuit if we've had a lifetime of not feeling uncomfortable. And so ultimately, that can be where that cognitive dissonance comes up, right? Feeling like, you know, giving up on diet culture is like a failing, but really I would say that that's a major victory, right? Resisting something so large and so influential that makes us feel really badly about ourselves, encourages us to judge one another, is something that's pretty incredible to do for ourselves and for one another. And so unpacking that and challenging the ideas that keep us from being able to access joy is really key. And body liberation is a tool that we can use in doing so when we're trying to reclaim joy in the bodies that we have as they are now. I'll throw the ball over to you, Christine, to speak to that.
So um, now focusing more so on claiming or reclaiming joy, we wanted to bring in, of course, this great book here by Adrienne Marie Brown on pleasure activism and centering the idea that, as Sookie has already said, like doing this work is really hard. And often the messaging is that folks with certain types of bodies are not allowed to have fun and not allowed to have um, joyful like feelings about their bodies, and so this could be one way of resisting in terms of experiencing joy, thinking about how we can thrive in the bodies that we have currently. Um, and of course, one of the ways in which that we can do that is through understanding what types of pleasures that we want to experience. And that definitely can very much be a full workshop in and of itself. But I'll turn it over to Sookie to quickly go over what that could look like.
Thanks, Christine. So there are lots of lessons that we can take from sex and relationship health, education in understanding the role of pleasure in our lives. And one of those is safety planning. Safety planning ultimately requires that in an instance where body terrorism is present, we assess the risks that we're likely to encounter and we make a plan to minimize and manage those risks and their potential for harm. And so there's several types of risks that we need to think about in safety planning for our pleasure. The first of which is, you the next one, Christine. Planning for our physical safety. So basics, right? I'm clearly a trained lifeguard because I'm like, let's think about sun and water safety. So how are we going to make sure that we're protecting ourselves from those UV rays? How are we going to make sure that we have the flotation devices we need to be able to stay afloat if we don't feel comfortable swimming and that we're not going too deep? And that we are swimming with a buddy, right? That we've considered our hydration and sustenance needs to be able to have a sustainable day at the beach, so that we're nourishing ourselves, that we're accessing enough hydration to not get heat or sunstroke. How are we going to get home safely, especially if we're spending the whole day at the beach and we need to go home in the dark? How can we like use the buddy system in that instance as well to plan for our safe travels there and back again from the beach? Any other considerations, feel free to drop them into the chat and I'll throw the ball over to you for the next set of considerations.
So if you haven't gotten the idea that Sookie and I really focus on emotions and feelings, this may be a very explicit slide to talk about considering emotional safety, because it's so important to recognize that feelings come up, regardless of how much we like or dislike having feelings, that it is something that will come up for us. And so understanding what types of boundaries we have with our bodies, what types of boundaries we need to have and enforce, whether it's internal boundaries of saying, you know what, I'm not taking in this messaging today, and internalizing it, or external boundaries and asking people, can you please not comment about my body? And saying that in order to ensure that you can feel emotionally safe or safer, and that you can then coexist in that space, right? Understanding how you can manage challenging feelings as they come up, having a buddy to say, hey, I'm gonna go to the beach today, can we just check in afterwards or during, or can I have a conversation with you as I walk to the beach from the parking lot, whatever that may be, to ensure that you can not so much push yourself over the edge, not just that, but also look at where that edge is and how you can stay as far away from that edge as much as possible. And that all of that is very much boundary work, to consider your emotional safety when you are heading out and thinking about it, or perhaps even before you head out, and perhaps you need a little pep talk with your hype team. You're able to pull together a hype team to be able to then get yourself out there. All of that is super valid and, of course, quite important depending on what your needs are and can be. And I'll throw it over to Sookie for the next one.
Which all ties into considering social safety. So how are we going to banish the body police? Which brings us back to the buddy system, right? Going back to, as Christine said, your personal hype team. Is it possible to go to the beach with folks who are going to hype you up? I always find, to go back to the story I was telling you about No Lose, that if I'm able to go to the beach with friends who are also like non-binary people, who are fat people, who are disabled people, who, if not, have like an understanding of body liberation and like center it in their own lives, that makes the experience a lot more pleasurable, because if there's like body police on the beach, then we can support one another and provide the support needed in those moments where like maybe we're having experiences of micro macro aggression, which brings us to the next point here, which is responding to harm, both in the moments and afterwards. How can we center care by planning the aftercare that we're going to need? A friend that we can call to comfort us if we have had a bad experience, and ideally being proactive before the harm happens can be helpful, because we can feel a little bit less taken by surprise when we've planned for the potential that it could take place. So go to the next one, Christine. Thank you. So I want to return here to the idea of reclaiming bodily autonomy in regards to dressing for success. So you'll notice that today I'm wearing my fabulous beach attire because I wanted to demonstrate what this can look like. I'm a big believer in queer maximalism as a resistance strategy. So as I've said, I'm often perceived as having too much gender, of being too much while simultaneously being not enough. And so intentionally being very loud and proud is a resistance strategy that's really very near and dear to my heart. I like very bright clothing and glasses. I like very loud prints, and that's part of claiming space for myself and my body, given that the ways in which I am like living in a body out of bounds means that often I'm experiencing both invisibility and hypervisibility. And queer maximalism as an intentional practice allows me to claim autonomy within that. Another way of thinking about it is like, I'm going to dictate why you're staring at me, right? Because I've chosen to be very loud and proud by wearing my femme or them armor by way of those loud prints. But that's not to say that's going to be a strategy that works for everyone. For other folks, maybe it's going to be wearing something that doesn't make you feel very noticeable, right? And it's okay if what feels like safety to you is being a retiring flower. There's no kind of better or worse here. It's really about doing what feels good for you, because ultimately you're in charge of your body, which brings us to the next slide here. which is focused on refusing and resisting. So thinking about how you can plan for the parts of being at the beach that bring up challenging feelings, as well as what actions you might be able to take to help you feel empowered in your body. Going back to what I was just sharing around like choosing your own adventure, right? What's going to feel good for you? Is it a matter of having like something jazzy to wear, having the right friends to go with, of going to just a particular beach or space that feels more safe than another, and really assessing that for yourself. So we wanted to finish off today with some affirmations, recognizing that like we've dove into some very challenging topics today. And so Christine and I will just kind of throw the ball back and forth and read these out for folks as we're closing for the day. So first up here, my body is a vessel that carries me around and allows me to experience the world. I will treat it kindly. Oh, Christine, you're on mute. Christine, you're on
Oh
mute.
no, I'm on mute. Okay, here we go. My body hair is normal, and when and how I choose to groom it is my choice.
My body will fluctuate and change over time, but that's okay. We're allowed to change.
My scars stretch. Stretch marks, discoloration, and cellulite are parts of me, and their presence does not make me any less valid or worthy.
I will treat my body kindly and respect it the way I hope to respect others and the way I deserve to be respected.
Anyone who deserves to be around me loves me for more than just my body and will treat me and my body with respect.
My weight is just a number on a scale. It does not impact how valid, valuable, and worthy of respect and care I am.
I will not hold myself to the body standards I see on social media. Most of it is inaccurate and unrealistic, anyways.
So, to close out our time together today, we wanted to invite you to think about the parts of the beach that bring you pleasure and to drop any response you'd like to into the chat. So, going back to that exercise perhaps that we did to start off our conversation, where you were thinking about kind of the feelings that came up when I read out those statements. That might be inspiration here. But otherwise, thank you so much for spending this time with us. And please feel free to drop any of those good things that bring you joy and pleasure into the chat as we're closing. And all the best to folks in accessing fun in the sun. Thanks for spending time today with us, the Body Buddies. And and all the best to folks moving forward and getting that sand out of your beach bags.